Welcome back to the Eyes on Israel, Israel Independence Day special. We're learning the story of the War of Independence in 1947 and 1948. In the previous two segments, we discussed the fact that there was a siege laid around Jerusalem, preventing vital water and food, vital supplies from getting to the over 100,000 Jewish residents of Jerusalem. The efforts by the nascent Israeli army to open the road to Jerusalem and get supplies in were largely successful. But within the city of Jerusalem, it was a different story. Yaakov, where are we and why is it significant to this part of the story?
We are currently inside the old city walls in the Jewish quarter, the heart of the Jewish community of Jerusalem for millennia, in the place where the local residents were in charge of defending themselves. There weren't many soldiers available to help them defend themselves here. And for the first 2 weeks of the State of Israel's existence, they fought a very brave battle to defend their homes and to defend the old city, the Jewish quarter of the old city. Unfortunately, they were up against the best army of the time, the Arab Legion of the Transjordanians. They didn't stand much of a chance. We're currently standing next to a pit that was dug in those 2 weeks where they placed the dead bodies because there were casualties and there was no way they were going to be able to take them outside of the city walls to the cemetery on Mount of Olives, and therefore they made a makeshift burial ground right inside, right where we're standing here. And 48 of the defenders were buried together in this mass grave. I do want to say that in Hebrew, the word for a mass grave is much more poignant. The word we use is kever achim, which means a brother's grave, which is perhaps more significant and more meaningful. That they fought and died as brothers. This is where we're standing right now. And just around the corner in the square is where the Jewish quarter surrendered. May 28th, 1948, 2 weeks into the state, they couldn't hold out any longer. The Jordanian army had been closing in on them, and they basically took the decision that they would surrender. Some of those who surrendered were taken into captivity into Jordan itself, and some were allowed onto the western side of the city. In any event, no Jew was left inside of the old city. And the commander...
Hold on a moment, just pause there. No Jew was left in the old city walls. Yaakov, if I'm not mistaken, this would mean that this was the first time in probably over 1,000 years or more, maybe 2,000 years, that there were no Jews in the old city.
This is true. In fact, the commander himself, the Transjordanian commander, Abdallah el-Tal, did two things. Firstly, once he kicked the Jews out of the old city, he systematically destroyed the Jewish quarter. All the synagogues were destroyed. Most of the buildings were destroyed in order to make their mark. And he wrote in his diary the following statement. He said, after more than 1,000 years, I have completely destroyed the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, something which will prevent the Jews from ever returning. That's what he wrote in his diary as he took the surrender and the Jews were led out of the old city. And as you said earlier, everyone could ask themselves, it's a very strange place to end our story. And I think it's actually very significant because there's an idea that tragedy is not a Jewish motif. We don't end our stories in depression or in destruction. There's always another chapter to be written. And this story of Jerusalem doesn't end in 1948. 19 years go by, no Jew can come into the old city, all the synagogues are destroyed, no Jew can access the Western Wall or the Temple Mount. But 19 years later, they started another war with us, which didn't work out so well for them, the Arab side, and that's the Six-Day War. And we were able to return after the Six-Day War. We recaptured the old city and rebuild the Jewish quarter. One of the things that allows us to be here today, obviously, and to access this place, all the buildings had to be renovated. So most of the buildings of the Jewish quarter are modern. In addition, in order to build these new buildings, they had to dig down. And in many cases, in digging down the foundations of the buildings, they discovered ancient artifacts going back thousands of years, showing the Jews had been here all along. There are many, many examples of ancient floors and what's called a mikvaot, baths from 2,000 years ago in this place, proving the Jews had always been here. But nevertheless, I think it's an important place to end our trip together in the Old City because It's not so much about the fact that we lose the battle. And most of today, or a large part of today, we've discussed the defeats that have taken place, whether it would be the underground movements that were the members of which were hanged, or whether it was the battles in Latrun, which each one was a failure. And even the fact that we succeeded in the Castle was only by a miracle. It was a lot of casualties. And here too, in the Old City, where we surrendered. But the idea is that the Spirit, as I started our journey together, the Spirit is what counts. Not, as God says, not by force or power, but through my Spirit. And it is the Spirit, the spirit of bravery that goes on. The spirit of bravery, which I believe is drawn from a very deep place. It's deep within our DNA, spiritually, and we have a historical precedent. And that is where I believe the state of Israel draws its power from. And that is the story of the revolt of the Maccabees, 2,200 years ago, approximately, where we rose up in revolt against the Greek Empire and established political independence in the land of Israel. Although we celebrate this every year at the Hanukkah festival, the way we celebrate it is by lighting a candelabrum in the same way that had been in the temple, the menorah. We light for 8 days, but the symbol of the eight candles, or the candlestick with eight lights on it, is the symbol of the Jewish people. Is really the most authentic and historical symbol of the Jewish people that we've held since the days of the Maccabees, wherever we've gone, and it is the symbol of the state of Israel. And it's more than just a physical symbol, it's what it represents. It represents that light of faith, the light of strength, of heroism, the Spirit, the light of the Spirit. And it's not by chance that it is with reference to that symbol that the prophet Zechariah makes the statement. It is not by power and might, but through my Spirit, says the Lord, when he's looking at that picture in his prophetic vision. And that's the vision I believe that we have. And sometimes we have it without being aware of it. It's inside of us. It allows the people to stand up and fight then and today, even though the odds seem to be against us. There's a sense that we're going to continue. And even though we can lose the battle, we're not going to lose the war. And if I would just pick up a thread that I mentioned, that Abdallah al-Tal, that Jordanian army commander that destroyed all the synagogues here, was not aware of the fact that the story doesn't end with destruction. The story ends with rebuilding. And if you walk around the old city today, you'll see those synagogues. The Horva synagogue was renovated just over 10 years ago. The Tiferet Yisrael is in the process of finishing off, being renovated. That these synagogues, these places are being rebuilt. The homes are being rebuilt. And we've come full circle to rebuilding ourselves in the land.
Yaakov, I want to pick up on something you just said, because I think it's such a powerful message. Again, not only to learn about Israel and to learn about the Jewish experience, but for everything we're all going through in the world today that's so full of turmoil, that you said that tragedy is not a Jewish motif. And if I could expand that, tragedy is not a biblical motif. Anyone of biblical faith knows that the end of the story is a good one. The end of the story is that good and truth win. We know that as a matter of faith. So optimism is not just an attitude, but it's a position, it's a faith position. Being pessimistic is not a position that anyone of faith should have. When we take ourselves back to that time, the moment of surrender in 1948, where for the first time since temple times, there's not going to be a single Jew in the old city walls of Jerusalem, and they're walking out of here feeling that even though we have a state, we don't have Jerusalem. Little did they know that less than 2 decades later, we'd be returning here and then starting to rebuild what we have today. And what we have today, as you said, is a flourishing old city Jewish community. And I think that's a lesson that everyone can take into what's going on in America, what's going on around the world, that dark times and these challenges, and even when they look like they're in the most tragic place, and even at a lower point than they've ever been. Remember, again, no Jews in the city of Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years. What a low point that must have been. But at the same time, with faith and with courage and with continuing to align ourselves with God, we know that the end of the story is good. And the lesson of the War of Independence and everything that's happened from that is really that it can turn out good. Look at where we are. Israel, we are fighting a war today, and we have to take that same lesson in. As dark as this war is, and as dark as our as the current pressure we're under from the US government and other governments are, and how much it looks like Israel's stuck in such a tough spot, we know that the end of the story is good.
Yes. And I was just going to say two things
Sure.
to add to that. One is that where the kids are playing in that open area, which was the place of the surrender, today is a place of life. There's a school there, and there's kids playing there in their free time. And on the side of the walls, someone wrote another verse from Zechariah, that prophet who lived here in Jerusalem all those years ago, 2,500 years ago, where he predicts a time will come again when the children will be playing in the streets of Jerusalem. And since that prophecy was said, we've been through a lot of ups and downs, and lots of downs more than ups. But the faith that we have that will happen keeps us going, gives us the energy, gives us the motivation to do the job at hand and to fight. And sometimes, just one more small point, which is this: the War of Independence is something we celebrate, we're grateful for, even though parts of the land were not in our possession, like the old city of Jerusalem, but we had something. And we're grateful for anything we have. And that's also part of the attitude that we have to rejoice and give thanks for the little that we have right now. And God willing, it'll expand to something bigger. And that is also relates to the story again of the Maccabees. The Maccabees revolt was not an instant victory over the defeat of the Greeks and taking the land. It was in stages. Stage by stage, they built up the country. And I believe that's a repeat of what we're going through right now with its ups and downs.
Thank you so much for watching this special episode of Eyes on Israel, the Independence Day special about Israel's War of Independence. God bless.